So this is going to be my short version of the Jordan Peterson Gold Rush. And I sort of had this idea when I was listening to Jordan's interview with Howard Bloom. And he had this really interesting quote about music. And then I started listening to this new song called Gold Rush by Death Cab for Cutie. And the two worlds started to coincide, and I started to see a gold rush happening with Jordan Peterson. So first, this quote goes something like this. He was talking to Howard Bloom, who was in the music industry for a long time. He says, "I've thought deeply about music. I've tried to figure out what it represents and why it has the effects it has. This is a neuroscientific view of it to some degree. It's better to think of the world as something that exists as patterns as opposed to objects." Now think about his recent conversations with Sam Harris here too, because I think this also fits into that. So an object would be a pattern that sustains itself across time. But that's not all that it is. Listen to that language, because you're going to hear with Peterson a lot of both and with Sam Harris a lot of either or kind of thinking. You can even think of the way the visual system works. We tend to think that there's a world out there and that there's an image projected onto our retinas, and then the image is reconstructed in our visual cortex, and then we become conscious of that image and plan our actions in consequence of that. But that isn't how it works. The way it works is that there are patterns in the world, and the patterns are then shifted into patterns of light, and then those are shifted into patterns of neural activity on the retina. And then those are shifted into patterns of neural conductance along the optical nerves. And then those patterns are transferred to the visual cortex. And then those are expressed as patterns of movement. So it's all the transformations of patterns. And the meaning of a visual perception is the pattern of action it gives rise to. Which is why you need embodiment to be able to perceive. He brought that up in the Ayn Rand Institute talk regarding the Roomba. And everyone kind of chuckled, but it's a really serious point. And I think the reason that music speaks so deeply to us of fundamental meaning is because it's actually the most representative art form. You know, because people think about it as, in some sense, as the least representative art form. And I don't think that's right at all. I think it represents the reality that exists in a profound sense, beyond what our senses reveal to us moment to moment. And when you're moving to the music, or when you're dancing as pairs to the music, it's the patterns of the cosmos, so to speak, manifesting themselves as the patterns of the music, manifesting themselves as the patterns of your body. And in syncopation with everyone else, it's also a symbolic representation of a harmonious and ideal society. So it is something beyond us. What struck me as near miraculous about music, especially in a rather nihilistic and atheistic society, is that it really does fill the void that was left by the death of God. And that's partly because you cannot rationally critique music. It speaks to you. It speaks of meaning. And no matter what you say about it, no matter how cynical you are, you cannot put a crowbar underneath that and lift it up and toss it aside. So this video is going to be basically a lyric analysis meeting with the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. And I want to start with what art is. And art, according to Northrop Frye, who's often quoted in Jordan's maps of meaning and cited, to Northrop Frye and to William Blake, art is the drama of creation, struggle, redemption, and restoration, those four parts, in the fallen life of a divine man. Basically what William Blake thought and what Frye brought up and what Jordan continues, I think, to believe, is that all true art is an expression, basically, of the biblical story, the biblical narrative. And whether the artist knows this or not, now see, Blake thought the artist was always conscious of this. Blake certainly was. But I don't think every artist is conscious of this, and I don't think Jordan believes every artist is conscious of this. And I think Jordan would also bring it back to Carl Jung about with his collective unconscious and the archetypes, and how that kind of comes to the surface in great artists, and they're able to create a work that's sort of right from their unconscious, that we're all a part of, that we've all have a common inheritance through our DNA regarding. So what's going on in the song? I'm going to have to get the lyrics up in case you're not familiar with Gold Rush. But I'm only going to analyze some of them, particularly the whole Gold Rush concept. But I'll do a quick read-through. Gold Rush is consistently said through the song, and it's basically what the singer says. It's about the construction going on in Seattle and how his past sort of hangouts are no longer there. His past memories are kind of destroyed because of the new construction. So it says, Gold Rush, digging for gold in my neighborhood where all the old buildings stood, and they keep digging it down and down so that their cars can live underground. The swinging of a wrecking ball through these lathe and plaster walls is letting all the shadows free, the ones I wish still followed me. And the chorus goes, change, please don't change, stay, stay the same. Followed me, followed me, followed me, followed me. It actually, strangely enough, this strikes me as a very Trumpian, Make America Great Again song. And if you look at the music video, it starts with the singer walking down the street of Seattle, and he's sort of walking through time as people walk towards him. And it seems like he starts with the good old days, and it seems like the woman is sort of from the 40s, 1940s. And then he goes decade by decade until he's sort of trapped in a mob of everybody on their cell phones, and he's sort of devoured by this mob of zombies. It's an interesting music video to watch. But yeah, again, it reminds me of something Trump might assent to. So keep saying Gold Rush. I remember a winter's night. We kissed beneath the street lamp light, outside our bar near the record store, that have been condos for a year or more. Now that our haunts have taken flight and been replaced with construction sites, oh, how I feel like a stranger here, searching for something that's disappeared. Digging for gold in my neighborhood, for what they say is the greater good, but all I see is a long goodbye, a requiem for a skyline. It seems I never stopped losing you, as every dive becomes something new, and all our ghosts get swept away. It didn't used to be this way. Again, he's looking at it very nostalgically, it seems. Again, the chorus, and then this last part is particularly interesting. I've ascribed these monuments a false sense of permanence. I've placed faith in geography to hold you in my memory. I'm sifting through these wreckage piles, through the rubble of bricks and wires, looking for something I'll never find, looking for something I'll never find. And this last part where he says, I've ascribed these monuments a false sense of permanence, just really reminds me of Shelley's poem, Ozymandias. And where Ozymandias thinks that his great works, the works of Egypt, the Pharaoh, are going to be known forever. He goes, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. He thinks that this is going to last forever, but of course we know nothing but sands stretch all around it as far as the eye could see. And if you want to hear a good reading of this, I recommend Ozymandias as read by Bryan Cranston from Breaking Bad. It was a commercial they did for season 5, I think. And I don't want to play, I would love to play it here, but of course my video would get taken down immediately by AMC. But anyway, the song is I think a really interesting song, and I think it relates back to Jordan Peterson in that there's a couple of things going on here. There's a gold rush, people are looking for value, and they're tearing up the old things, his old neighborhood. He's placed a materialistic value on the neighborhood without that sense of permanence. He's sort of lost, and he's losing all. He can't hold anyone in his memory. They're all kind of held by the geography, by the old places he used to be. And he's going through the bricks and the rubble, the atomist view of society, and there's nothing there. And he'll never find it. And I think that is the materialist dilemma which they have to face, and I think it's bubbling up through this song unconsciously. And so let's get to how this relates to Jordan. A gold rush, if you look up gold rushes, they've happened since ancient times, and famously in America, I think it was 1849, there was the Californian gold rush. And interestingly enough, the people who usually profited most were the people who were surrounding the gold rush, the gold miners. They were the people who profited were the ones giving them food, shelter, and tools to work with. And, you know, whether you struck gold or not, that was kind of random, and many people didn't, obviously. But the people who had a solid business plan, providing the miners with goods and services, those were the ones who usually made a lot of profit. Now, I think the gold rush regarding Jordan Peterson, you can see in two ways. I think a false way and a true way, a materialist way and a spiritual way. And so a lot of people are sort of rushing at Jordan Peterson, trying to find gold, and Jordan is criticized for sort of selling them this gold. Perhaps he's criticized for selling fool's gold. And I think he's being criticized that way by materialists who do not understand that he's trying to lead the way and give us the tools so that we can find spiritual gold. And this is something that is just not in their, it's not in their vision. They can't understand that. People criticize Jordan for making a lot of profit, a lot of money off of his followers, but to me that's not what he's doing. That's just incidental to what he's doing. Of course, people who are grateful for what he's doing are supporting him on Patreon, and they view him as an important voice to have in our culture. That's not him trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes at all. And I think what's an interesting correlation here is Jung's view of the alchemists. So Jung kind of cracked the code of the alchemists, and everybody wanted to crack the code of the alchemists, especially back in the days when they were practicing, because people thought the alchemists were turning lead into gold, and everybody wanted to know their secrets. Sometimes the alchemists were even kidnapped or abducted, and people tried to force them to reveal their secrets, and so they had ways of communicating amongst each other sort of in code. And Jung thought he sort of broke the code, and what he thought the alchemists were doing, and what I think they actually were doing based on everything, all the evidence I read that Jung presented, the alchemists were in a world where subject and object weren't quite differentiated. This happened a couple hundred years after the alchemists' heyday. And so in their world, they sort of had a physical representation of the world, which was lead, and the lead was a representation of themselves. And they were trying to work on that lead to bring it up to a higher state of being. They were working on their consciousness, or Jung said they were working on their consciousness through this physical work. And so there was always a physical embodiment of a spiritual world. And so the gold they were seeking was really the highest level of consciousness, or the highest value, which they held was God. They were trying to come closer to God in their alchemy. And it was really a highly spiritual practice. And so the materialist would criticize and mock the alchemists these days. Scientists say, oh, they were such fools. They could never turn lead into gold with what they were doing. But it was Jung who saw it on another level, a metaphorical level. And that's the difference of language and interpretation that Jordan's getting into with Sam Harris constantly, is this battle over language and interpretation, over metaphor versus more factual language. And so if you see the world the way the alchemists saw it, you would understand it's nothing to laugh at. It's a spiritual practice. But that's not the world we're currently in. We're currently in a materialist-dominated world. The language is what Vico called third phase language, and it's very scientific. It's the world of lead. There is no gold in this world, or there's no turning lead into gold. We are what we are, basically. So here I want to get into Jordan's function in this gold rush. And it's very similar to that of a modern-day prophet. What he's doing is reestablishing tradition and representing old values. He's making them new again. He's doing this primarily, I think he's catching a lot of our attention. I myself was a materialist Christian, where I had one side of me completely indoctrinated in the materialist worldview, and then I had another side that just took a leap of faith, a la Soren Kierkegaard, regarding the Christian worldview. And I think Jordan got my attention because he's steeped in the scientific materialist worldview. He can speak that language, but then he could also speak the language of religion and myth. And he doesn't say it's one or the other. He says, let's talk about both. Let's use both. I think that's very attractive to people. And when he builds a case from the bottom up, using evolutionary history, going all the way back to the biochemistry of lobsters, and bringing the importance of that into into how we live now. And so he has that sort of scientific edge to him. And then he brings in the mythological edge and the religious language, and says, here's how this works towards how we live today. And he sort of brings them both together and says, these are two pillars to our house that I'm building. And I think that's a much more solid foundation than just science alone or just religion alone. I think they work very well together. So you'll hear him talk about that which is most highly valued as sort of the psychological representation, the pinnacle in our psyche of what we value. That is the God placeholder. And you're going to have a material value, and in the song, that is the gold and gold rush. People are digging up the streets to find profit, to make parking garages for cars. And the author of the song finds that very off-putting, because he actually values something different, and he doesn't perhaps quite realize it. He's associating the memories he's had, the good times with friends, with these physical places. The physical place was an interesting and important part of his life, but as he finds, the physical fades away. The physical does not last forever. And he's finding his memories, the good times, are fading with the physical world that he values so much. And I think this is very much an indication or symptom of a materialist worldview. Once the material world changes so significantly, you're forced to just go along with it, and you lose what you valued most. If you hold it to a more spiritual worldview, the whole world can change. It always does. But that doesn't mean your values need to change, or that your God has to change. Your psychological, what you value most. And you have the metaphorical versus the objective, and that's what Peterson's trying to go back and forth with in his talks with Sam Harris about. I haven't still listened to those bootleg copies yet, but I probably should. The function of myth, and I quoted Fry in a previous video about this, but the function of myth for human society, the myth looks inwards towards how we ought to act, and it's about our sacrosanct traditions and all the values we hold as a society. That's the function, is to look inwards. Science is something that looks outwards. It can't possibly tell us anything we value, because it's busy looking outside our society at the natural world. And you're going to see that dichotomy play out with Sam Harris and Jordan, because he's fulfilling the mythical function that looks inwards. He's bringing dead facts into living truths. And a lot of people were told all about the Bible as children. They know some of the stories here and there, but those seem like dead facts. They don't seem like living truths. And what Jordan is doing, he's using other stories we know, like Pinocchio or whatever Disney movies he's quoting, Beauty and the Beast, for example. He's using those other truths that are sort of more alive to people and saying, look, this is how the old facts and the old stories fit in. This is how everything actually is supposed to work. Now, the Bible is history. Like I mentioned before, there's 3 phases of language that Fry refers to, and I don't have time to go into them right now, but I think I go over it in my missing link video. I'm trying to make this video as short as possible. I think I only have a couple of more slides to go over, but there's phases to language, from poetic to sort of a very concrete and scientific language. Jordan and we all are in this 3rd phase of language, which is very scientific and very concrete. Jordan is straddling these phases of language because he understands the mythical value of metaphor and language, mythical kind of language. So he's not straddling doubt or disbelief. He's really straddling linguistic phases instead. So the history, a lot of moderns think of history as past time. They think of it in a sort of scientific way, that everything could be sort of dug up in an archaeological dig, and you can test it and date it with carbon dating very scientifically. But history is not really, it's not really that way at all. And I think Jordan makes a case, as does William Blake and Fry, that it's more about present vision. And that's kind of a hard thing to understand. It's a very odd thing to say. But Mamet, who was interviewed by Ben Shapiro recently on his Sunday show, quoted a rabbi, and it was a really interesting quote, I thought. He said, "The Bible is not what happened, like a literal history, although it might have elements of that in it. So it's not what happened exactly, it's what always happens." I thought that was a really brilliant way of describing, especially the Old Testament. I think Fry would agree to that, and William Blake, and I think Jordan as well. It's not what happened, it's what always happens. Now, doesn't that sound very deterministic? And I think it does. But I think what you find in the New Testament, and what Fry and William Blake find in the New Testament, is this a new freedom. The New Testament, Jesus sort of gives us our freedom back to us. And I think Fry tries to make the case that Blake sees this only in an imaginative way, that he reads the New Testament in a very poetic, non-literal way. But I think what Jordan is struggling with, and what a lot of us struggle with, is that there seems to be something more to it than that. I think C.S. Lewis put it very well also, is that the claims this Jesus is making seem to either they have to all be true, or they have to all be false. There's no in between. They can't just be figuratively true. They have to be literally and figuratively true. And I think this is where Jordan, when he talks about the resurrection of Christ, where he's talking about, we don't know the extent to which this highly metaphorical realm has touched down into the material realm that we're familiar with, or more familiar with. What if the two realms meet, and they met in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ? I think that's what Jordan's thinking about. And I think, to me, that's what Blake, I'm no Blake scholar, but I sort of read that in Blake. He says too many things that don't make any sense unless there is a belief that Jesus' life and resurrection is not true only figuratively, as a psychological kind of archetypal figure, but also literally. And this is the great mystery of the Bible, is that it took the metaphorical and made it, instantiated it, and gave it an embodiment in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So without that new freedom, we're sort of stuck in this legalistic, materialist, deterministic world of Sam Harris, where we're like cogs tyrannic, moving by compulsion each other, as Blake said. We just can't help it. We're stuck in this material world. And you'll hear Paul Vanderklay sometimes mention how much of ourselves really is our stories. We are our stories, and perhaps it is the story that is really the true reality of our being taking shape. Carl Jung thought it was important for people to recognize that they may be playing a part or a role in an archetypal story. And it may be that of a villain or a hero, or in a comedy or tragedy, but it's important to find this out, to become aware, to become conscious of your story, and take control and take shape of it before it ends in certain tragedy, for some people, I guess. In Sam Harris's world, we never take control. We never become conscious. We remain in a world that's just lead. The materialist criticized Jordan for selling snake oil, for inviting us to become aware of our reality on all levels instead of just the material level. He invites us to live in a world of the alchemists. They may look foolish, but that's only when you don't understand that the gold they sought was indeed a spiritual gold. And this is the gold rush Jordan is in the midst of. That which is most valued spiritually is the spiritual gold of God, in the instantiated form of Jesus Christ, who is reestablished and recreated in us and through us, using what Blake would call the divine imagination. And I think that's the hard concept to grasp, and I'm trying to work it over through these videos. The divine imagination, reinstantiating and recreating and reestablishing the Church of God, Jesus Christ himself in us and through us at all times. And I think that's also what Jordan Peterson is working his way through as he read Northrop Frye, as he quoted him and cited him many times in Maps of Meaning, as he probably read Blake, and as he's working through the Bible series itself, going over the psychological significance of the Old Testament. This has to be playing a role in his way of thought. So if this was interesting to you at all, please like and subscribe. Thanks.